Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. I'm Kate, and I'm flying solo today while my partner in crime, Amy Wonka, is on vacation. In this podcast, we review and provide commentary on resources, literature, and discuss issues related to the field of speech and language pathology. You can use this podcast for ASHA CEUs. For more information about us and CEUs, go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. SLP Nerdcast is brought to you in part by listeners like you. Even small contributions keep our CEU prices low and our program ad-free. You can contribute on our website by clicking Support Our Work. On our site, you can also find permanent products, notes, and other handouts. Some items are free, others are not, but everything is always affordable. Visit our website to submit a call for papers to come on the show and present with us, or contact us anytime on Facebook, Instagram, or at info@slpnerdcast.com. We love hearing from our listeners, and we can't wait to learn what you have to teach us. Just a quick disclaimer, the contents of this episode are not meant to replace clinical advice. SLP Nerdcast, its hosts and guests do not represent or endorse specific products or procedures mentioned during our podcast, unless otherwise stated. We are not PhDs, but we do research our material. We do our best to provide a thorough review and fair representation of each topic that we tackle. That being said, it's always likely there's an article that we've missed or another perspective that isn't shared. If you have something to add to the conversation, please email us. We would love to hear from you. So hello, everyone. Reading that whole long thing by myself felt like a million years. So if you're still with us, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm hosting solo today while Amy, my counterpart, is on vacay, but I am not here lonely. I have the great pleasure of welcoming Leigh Porter. Welcome, Leigh.
Hi, how's it going, Kate?
It's going. I'm so excited to have you here today. I know we have collaborated a little bit before, and I'm just so excited to welcome you onto the Nerdcast.
I'm thrilled to be here because as I, told you before, I love the name of your podcast. So the opportunity to get nerdy about SLP stuff is a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're so excited to have you. I'm so excited to have you. You are here to discuss creating a home program for mild aphasia. And I, as our listeners know, I know very little about pretty much everything in the adult world and the medical SLP world. So I'm really excited to learn a lot from you today. And I wonder if before we get started, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. All right. So my name's Leigh Porter. I live in Kansas City, and I'm a practicing medical SLP, and I work in outpatient primarily. That's my love. I love working in outpatient, but I also work in acute and inpatient rehab units. So kind of across all those settings, I got inspired to start a podcast called Speech Uncensored Podcast to connect medical SLPs with meaningful resources, emerging research, and practical tools. When I looked out into the great wide world of the internet, I found a ton of stuff geared towards school-based and pediatric SLPs, but I wasn't finding a whole lot out there for SLPs working with adults and in hospitals and in that kind of setting. There's a lot more now, within the past few years, which is great and awesome to see. So I thought we could use a podcast that really covers all the topics that we work on in the medical field.
And I've listened to your podcast. It's awesome. If any of our listeners have not cruised on over and checked it out, please do. And you guys are doing some big things over there. I recently saw you post something about your development council, which is awesome.
Yeah. I'm so thrilled that the podcast has grown to where I need help.
It's awesome.
This is quite a big undertaking. I mean, you know all about it. It's more than a one-woman show. So I'm really thrilled that I've been able to create this development council, which brings in other SLPs who want to have an impact on the field and contribute and help it grow and provide more resources and be more useful to practicing clinicians.
It's all about community. I love it. More brains, always better than one brain. I mean, I have yet to find a clinical scenario where that is not the case. Okay. I guess you could say the opposite is too many cooks in the kitchen. But when it comes to learning and it comes to academic material, more brains, always better than one. I'm so in support of what you're doing over there with your podcast. It's so great. Before we get into the nitty gritty related to what you're going to present to us today, I do need to read our learning objectives and financial and non-financial disclosures. Sometimes people write in and ask me to skip this part because it's long and boring. I can't. ASHA makes me read it. So hang in there. I'll try and get through it as quickly as possible. Learning objective number 1, identify 2 evidence-based practices to use with patients with mild aphasia. Learning objective
Oh, so I just wanted to interject. I'm going to tell everybody what those two learning objectives are. Sorry, what those two things are. It's CART, copy and recall treatment, and ARCS, attentive reading and constraint summarization. So there's your little teaser to keep you listening.
Oh,
Okay, what's
perfect.
number 2?
There you go. Okay, so learning objective number, I'm going to start from the beginning because I don't know where I left off. Learning objective number 1, identify 2 evidence-based practices to use with patients with mild aphasia. Learning objective number 2, describe how to modify treatment protocols to increase complexity level for mild aphasia. And learning objective number 3, identify at least 3 resources for implementing treatment approaches with mild aphasia. Leanne has created this amazing handout that will be available in the show notes that is directly related to that third learning objective. So I'm sure we'll talk about it multiple times throughout the course of the episode, but just letting everybody know right up front, that is available for download on our website. Financial and non-financial disclosures, Leanne's financial disclosures. Leanne is employed by the University of Kansas Health System and receives honorariums from speechtherapypd.com. Non-financial disclosures. Leanne is the host of the Speech Uncensored podcast. Kate, my financial disclosures. I'm the owner and founder of Grandbois Therapy and Consulting LLC and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. My non-financial disclosures. I'm a member of ASHA STIG 12 and serve on the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm also a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy, Mass ABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and the corresponding Speech Pathology and Applied Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group. Okay, so Leanne, I'm wondering if maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about maybe what aphasia is, just as a refresher.
Okay, so aphasia is a language disorder as the result of a neurological event, most often a stroke, could be an aneurysm or an anoxic brain injury as well. That's not an exhaustive list. There can be other events that result in language impairment, but most often from an injury to the left side of your brain.
So I as a person who knows very little about this, I do equate aphasia with a stroke.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's, I know one of the first things you want to do as we go through this material is sort of establish a frame of reference and set the stage. And there is it's the general takeaway is it's as a result of some neurological change.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And it can have many expressions. Like it can affect a lot of different ways that you use or understand language. And for the purposes of our talk today, I'm mostly talking about like mild aphasia, and I'm really not like narrowing it down to any one type. Like I'm not just talking about patients with anomic aphasia, or conductive aphasia or Wernicke's or Broca's. Like there's so many. I don't want to narrow it down too much, because kind of one of the things I want to emphasize is how adaptable you can make things to fit your patients with different types of aphasia. And the other thing that I love doing is using approaches that are what I think of as holistic. So they involve reading and writing and speaking, so that they kind of incorporate all or most of the realms that we use language. And because this is homework, they're not really able to do a lot of listening because I'm not like recording something for them to do, which would be a really cool idea. So the two activities that we're going to talk about today, CART and ARCS, really use all three of those realms, reading, writing, and speaking.
And for the sake of, since this is an audio medium, that's CART, C-A-R-T, and ARCS, A-R-C-S.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I'm going to tell you what they stand for and what they mean all in depth coming up here shortly. But I want to really kind of flesh out that frame of reference. So I'm coming at this from like an outpatient frame of reference. So my patients live at home and they're able to travel into the rehab department to see me. This population, they're often retired, but not always. They often have a significant other, like somebody else, but they might live alone. So there's at least generally like one other person in their immediate environment, but not necessarily a ton of children. So like my primary people that I work with are retirees living with a spouse. Okay. Now they might present with complaints of word finding, which is very, very frequent, right? So they'll say, I know what I want to say, but I can't find the word. But then when we're doing our interview and they're providing a detailed personal history and we're having a conversation back and forth, it's going very well. Like, so I'm wondering, like, so where are they experiencing this problem? Because sometimes when I say mild aphasia, I mean very mild, to where they're testing very high. Like, basically our aphasia assessments really aren't picking up any deficits. But that person, that patient, they know something's wrong with their language. There is something bothering them because they're so much more in tune to how they've always used language and what's changed. So sometimes our assessments just can't measure up.
I think that this is a really interesting profile because often when you think of aphasia, you think of somebody who is experiencing something that significantly impacts their daily activities. And I love the perspective of it may not be affecting their daily activities to a point where they can't work or they can't, enjoy life, but it's bothering them. It's their values and their perspective that is really bringing them into your care. And as we know, and we repeat here often, client perspectives and values is part of our evidence-based practice. So I love that you've honed in on that perspective. That's awesome.
And so what happens is with our patients, they can be a little, like, their deficits can be a little more obvious too, but even then there may be hesitations or pauses in their conversation while they search for that word. But they still test fine on our assessments. And so if there are detectable or very, very subtle differences to their language, it still affects them, and that they may withdraw. So it will affect how they interact and engage in their typical daily life. It will have impacts, even if they're not showing like obvious impairments on our tests. Like, it really matters to them. It affects them deeply.
Of course it does. I mean, language is everywhere. Social connectedness, it's everywhere. So I think that's such a valid point. So tell us a little bit about CART and ARCs. I don't even know anything about this, as you know.
Yes. Okay. Well, also, when we talk about a home program, basically, I don't know, that's like medical speech or lingo for, like, it's homework. It's what we send home with them, right? So that's what I'm talking about, is how to take some tools that you start in therapy and send home with them so that they continue working on these principles outside of therapy. All right. So we're going to start with CART, and that's copy and recall treatment. And it's a lexical treatment for writing single words for people with severe aphasia and agraphia. And I love that because I'm here talking about mild aphasia, right? But I'm like, let's talk about CART. So one thing that we have to do when we're working with mild aphasia is adapt and modify treatment protocols to fit this population to increase the complexity of it. So I was introduced to CART and I thought it was really interesting. And I'll talk about the process that I kind of stumbled upon working with a patient where I use it at the sentence level. So first, I'm going to talk about what it is in the literature. So it's writing single words, and it requires a lot of repetition. So motivation to improve and determination to practice are essential. And what you do is you pick 20 to 25 words to train with your patient in sets of 5 at a time. And I'm going to quickly go through the protocol of what that looks like when you sit down with your patient. You can use picture stimuli to assist with comprehension. And so if dog was a word on your list as an example, you would show them a picture of the dog and say, what is this? And you wait for a verbal response, because they also know that even though this is a lexical treatment for writing, like, never pass up an opportunity for verbal production, right? Once you tell them what it is, or they know what it is, and they write the word, you give them a handwritten model of the word, say, here's the word dog, copy it 3 times, please. And you give them feedback about the accuracy with each copying attempt. Once they copy it 3 times, you cover all that up and you ask them to spell it from memory 3 times, and you provide feedback at each attempt. And so every time they write the word dog from memory, you cover it, ask them to write it again, you cover it, you ask them to write it again the 3rd time. This is an abbreviated protocol because in the literature, it gives you this whole big, beautiful flow chart of, like, oh, if they make a mistake here, what do you do? How many times do you repeat this step before moving on? So there's a lot of guidance in the literature that was published on CART. So I highly recommend reading the article. It's excellent.
And all of those references will be in the show notes. And does the literature support modifying this protocol for more mild aphasia, or is this just an accommodation that people do in clinical settings as they see fit?
I'm not aware of anything that's been published on modifying CART for increased complexity at this time. I think it's just something that, like me, for example, that I've done like in the spur of the moment, and I found it worked and I went with it.
Oh, but no, I think that makes perfect sense.
Mhm.
And I have to assume that the long-term goal of this implementation strategy or this treatment strategy is really to improve phonological awareness and writing skills, or are there additional benefits that the patient will have?
Yes, the CART at its like original intent was to address the lexical treatment, so writing at the single word level for people with severe aphasia and agraphia.
Okay.
Yes. What I've done is, well, I'll get to that in a second. I just completely radically changed it. Like it's insane, but we'll get to that. There is one modification that is in the literature about adapting CART for texting. It's still at the single word level, but they published like a case study that talked about using it with a patient. And just like in the handwritten version of CART, treatment was directed towards 5 words at a time. And the criterion to move on to the next set was 80% accuracy for typed spelling.
Interesting.
And yeah, and so just briefly, really glazing over a lot of this, also a really good article to read. What they found was that the time to train the words and the accuracy immediately after treatment were comparable for the texting version and the handwritten modality. But for this particular participant that they did the study on, long-term retention was stronger for words trained with pencil and paper compared to those trained with a cell phone.
Interesting. And they did that study with a cell phone, not a traditional keyboard.
Correct. It was on the patient's cell phone, and they chose to type it in all caps because that was how that patient actually like hand wrote things. He wrote in all
Interesting.
caps. So he turned on the all caps on his cell phone and did it that way.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting. And I think that seems like a very functional application or extension of research because technology is everywhere. And I'm sure texting is, it's a huge part of all of our lives. So that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's fun because when you do like the recall portion of that at the single word level on the cell phone, like once you type it, then you just delete it. Then you type it again
Right.
and then you delete it. Like it's really easy. Um,
Oh,
so yeah,
interesting.
like,
Interesting.
and that kind of gives us the idea that like, yes, you can take what's been published and modify it to fit your patient's needs. Like
Mhm.
I used to think like if I deviated from the procedure that was published, like I was messing it up. I wouldn't get the same results. I wouldn't get any results. Like it wouldn't help my patient. But like, no, I was very mistaken.
Well, and I didn't realize we were going to be talking so much about the evidence-based triangle
Mm-hmm.
model,
Mm-hmm.
but that is also part, collecting internal evidence is also evidence-based practice. So I think it makes a lot of sense that if you take a procedure that is published in the external evidence on something with a more severe form of the disorder that you're treating, but your internal evidence, the data that you collect on your treatment approach, if that shows you your treatment is working, that it's still evidence-based practice. So that I think that makes a lot of sense. Kudos to
Mm-hmm.
you for doing that.
Thanks. Okay, so now I want to tell you about how I heavily, heavily modified CART. And it comes in conjunction with talking about the complexity approach to treatment. So I'm going to start by talking about the complexity approach really quick. Basically, there are a bunch of different kinds of studies out there by researchers Thompson and Shapiro that show that treatment with the complexity approach results in more pronounced effects and simpler quote structures emerge without direct treatment. You
Interesting.
know, yeah, because we're trained, you start at the simplest and you stair step your way up to more complex. That's our hierarchy. That's what we're trained to do, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
what we understand. It's counterintuitive to jump ship and like go like jump 3 steps forward. But that's exactly what I did with a patient with severe aphasia and apraxia of speech.
So the complexity approach, just for the sake of clarifying, is starting treatment with a more complex activity. What exactly does that mean, complexity approach?
Okay, so when you use complex language material as a starting point for treatment of sentence structural deficits, what happens is the results cascade and generalize into simpler linguistically related material. So you don't have to have a patient who can utter or verbalize words or phrases to start working on simple sentences.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now that, once again, this is something that I think is very dependent upon the patient that you're working with. Because if that patient is very hesitant or doesn't have any confidence, then they might be have limited motivation to really put themselves out there and try. Sometimes people don't like to try and fail, right? It's always about finding that Goldilocks zone. Like how much can we gently, kindly, encouragingly push without sending them into the red zone where they kind of shut down.
Yeah, I don't like to fail. I think that's pretty fair to say that somebody who is coming to you for therapy and is probably already feeling a little bit more vulnerable needs to be right in that. I love the term Goldilocks zone. I think that that's a great descriptive word. And I think it's also, it makes a lot of sense to choose these. We customize everything that we do, but just considering the profile of your patient. So how did you use this complexity approach with CART?
Okay, so it started all with this particular patient that I'm going to walk you through. And for like HIPAA and respect for their privacy, I'm going to use a different name than what their name is, but I'm going to give him a name so that I'm not just using pronouns. All right, so with Don, he had severe aphasia and apraxia of speech. Automatic speech was very poor. So like he couldn't like do those automatic things like counting to 5, ABCs, singing happy birthday, days of the week, months of the year. Like none of that was happening. He had been through therapy at the acute level, inpatient rehab level, maybe home health. I can't remember if he had home health or not. But he'd had lots of speech therapy in the past. And so his wife mentioned that at the inpatient rehab level, he was successful using a blended melodic intonation therapy approach using the phrase, "My name is Don." But when I asked him, "Hey, what's your name?" he could not say Don. But if we did the "My name is Don" action, he could initiate and closely approximate to where I could understand what he was saying. It was wild. He couldn't say his name in isolation, but when he had that carrier phrase, once he got started on that carrier phrase, Don came out. Or
it's a motor plan. He had to start at the beginning of his motor plan, maybe.
Yes.
Interesting.
Right? So I was like, okay, carrier phrases work. And how can I get him practicing at home? So that's where I thought of CART, and I was just like on a limb. I was like, well, I can't do single words with him because they don't work. He needs those carrier phrases. So I started using carrier phrases with our specific vocabulary that we wanted to use, starting with things that were important to him, like his wife's name, names of his pets, other things that we identified were meaningful to him. And they really started working. So it was amazing. So for him, what we did at the sentence level was I asked him to create sentences that were meaningful to him, starting with a topic and a list of vocab words that his wife helped us to supply. Now, he couldn't necessarily create sentences on his own. So there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of me asking, is this clarifying what he was trying to say? He would use the bus to travel around, and he was trying to get me to write a sentence about what it ended up being was about how annoying it was to wait for the bus. So it took us some time to get there, but he helped me create the sentences that were meaningful to him that we wrote down on a piece of paper. And then I ended up typing up because I didn't want there to be any issue with him being able to decipher my handwriting. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to transition to what CART looks like at the sentence level on a piece of paper. And what I did at the top of that paper was I wrote down 3 instructions, kind of the steps for what to do. And then under that, there is a very simple table of 10 lines, 10 rows, and 2 columns. In the first column is where we would type out the sentence that he helped me create that was about something meaningful and important to him in his daily life, and it followed a theme. So it wasn't just a bunch of really random sentences. They might be about his meeting his wife, celebrating anniversaries, when they got married, how they met. Then maybe another page would be about his pets. Another page would be about his hobbies and his interests. So going back to what that piece of paper looks like, in that simple table, 2 columns, 10 rows, on the left would be the sentences that we've created. His first instruction was to read that sentence out loud because his reading was intact. He could read. With the apraxia of speech, his verbalizations were much more not great. So, that very technical term there, totally use that in my documentation.
Not great.
They were not great. So,
I follow.
Yes. So reading comprehension and reading to speak worked out much better than trying to generate a sentence on his own, like from his head. Does that make sense? So reading out loud, he got better accuracy with expression than trying to generate a sentence in his head to like maybe answer a question or respond in a conversation to me. So he was able to read the sentence out loud. Then on the line next to it in the other column, I asked him to copy that sentence. So he was able to read it out loud, practice that verbal expression, and then write it out next to it. Then once he finished writing it, I asked him to read it again out loud, read what he wrote. On the back of that page was the same table, but it was empty. So 2 columns, 10 rows, blank. When he flips over the paper, I want him to write that sentence that he read twice and copied once, and then read it out loud. And some interesting things that I would find is that when they would write it, and there would be some errors, and I'd be like, okay, does that look good? And they're like, yeah, it looks great. And I'd be like, okay, read it out loud. When they went back and they read their work out loud, that's when they found errors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so oftentimes they might be able to fix it, or they might need assistance in fixing it. Also, they could flip the paper back over and use the model to fix it. Because in the end, this is a homework assignment. So I'm working with them on becoming their own clinician, fixing their own errors, being aware of their own errors. So it's that whole like problem solving hierarchy. Like, can you identify an error if one exists? Can you create a solution to fix it? And can you execute that solution accurately?
Can I ask a question that is related but slightly unrelated? So
Always.
this treatment approach, I have to assume, is very, the efficacy of that treatment approach is rooted in compliance with actually completing the homework, because you're as an outpatient clinician, you're prescribing these activities, but the practice and repetition that's going to really improve outcomes is rooted in the homework. How do you encourage that kind of compliance to really see these outcomes? Or is that not is that relationship that I just made wrong?
Oh, no, that's accurate. Yes.
Okay.
I'm lucky. One of the things that I love about outpatient is that the patients come in motivated to work. They know they have a problem. They want to fix it. Generally, of course, that's not always across the board.
Got it.
But that's the majority. And so I give them a little brightly colored folder. That's their homework folder that helps them keep all their papers together. Because I give them all kinds of stuff, educational handouts to let them know like, hey, what's going on. And I build that expectation that I totally anticipate that they will work on this at home and bring it back. I also ask them, is this something you're interested in doing? Do you think that this will help you? And if they're wishy-washy or they're unsure, I'm like, what I want you to do is give it a try, your best try, and let's see how it helps. Mm-hmm. If you absolutely hate it, we don't have to do it. I want to do things that you find useful and meaningful as well.
Got it. That makes sense. Okay. I'm sorry that I derailed you. I just was
No.
thinking about it just in my own clinical practice, working with a totally separate population, getting that compliance can be a challenge sometimes. But I think you've made
Oh,
such
yeah.
a great point about the motivation. And these people are, it's a key component for success. So makes sense.
Yeah. And like stumbling upon this approach and building it with this particular patient really was a mixture of like all the best possibilities coming together. This patient was highly motivated, just a joy to be around, had so much that he wanted to share, did not mind. I mean, at some level, of course, we mind when it doesn't come out the way we want it to and need it to. There's frustration there, but he had like such a positive spirit. He kept trying. He kept working at it. Just a real treat. So
That's lovely.
yeah.
That's lovely.
Before I forget, one other really awesome benefit of doing the complexity approach that I wanted to highlight was that the number of treatment sessions required for improvement and generalization is less when you do the complexity approach versus our traditional start easy and go high. There was a study that Thompson did in 1998 where participants who began treatment with complex structured required a mean of 13 sessions to reach criterion, which was 80%, whereas those trained from simple to complex required a mean of 34 sessions.
Holy cow, that's less than half.
Yep. It's crazy, right?
Wow.
Thompson did another study in 2003 and found that when training from complex to simple required 12 sessions, and from our traditional simple to complex, 28 sessions.
Holy moly. So if you have a patient who can tolerate or is willing to experience the difficulty of a complex task, that is definitely bang for your buck right there. You should do it. That's what
I say go exploring, like try things out.
I love
because
that.
you're not, if you try something out that you're like, oh my gosh, they're going to do terrible at this. Like this is way too complex for them. You might be pleasantly surprised, and maybe it is. That's a terrible idea, but you tried it. And it might give you an idea of a way to maybe simplify it to meet in the middle. It's just, we've got to go exploring with our patients. We've got to try things out.
That sounds so open-minded. Just go exploring, no judgment, sort of see what you find. I love that.
Yeah.
So tell me, do you have more to talk to us about CART, or are we into the ARCs now?
I might do really quickly how I've used CART with my patients, just a couple examples.
Yeah, I would love that.
So I did have a patient who was planning on returning to work. And so we did CART a few times, a couple pages that was specific to typical things he might say at work. Another one was retired, but still felt very invested and senses of accomplishment in the type of work that they did for a living. So I just had him tell me about his work and wrote down things about that, like achievements and all kinds of things. So it was really meaningful to him to read these things out loud and practice writing them, because it was like a refresher on, how awesome that person was. So like whatever it takes.
Seriously.
And so for that patient, their goals were actually to improve reading and writing skills. Now that first patient I had, because their reading and writing, well, their reading was stronger than their writing, which was stronger than their speaking, right? So I used CART to really address the speaking skills by using their strengths of reading and writing. And then on the flip side, I used it with a patient to improve their reading and writing skills, because they were at a level where they could do CART at the sentence level, or it was impaired enough that working at the sentence level worked for that patient. Was that a little confusing?
No, it sounds like a very flexible treatment strategy.
I think anything where you're using 3 or 4 of our modalities, where you're using reading, writing, speaking, and listening.
It's holistic. I love it.
Yes, you can address anything with it.
Yep.
Use their strengths to address their weaknesses.
Yep.
Then at that point, you're really only finding out like how much the patient likes or dislikes that particular style of technique or modality. Because I also used CART to target verbalizing numbers. So the family member reported that the patient would often say the wrong number, talking about like times, phone numbers, or addresses. So I was like, well, okay, let's use the reinforcement of reading, like seeing something and writing it, to work on speaking, like producing, verbalizing the right numbers. So I was like, let's give it a shot and see what happens. And for this particular patient, he hated CART. He was like, I don't want to do this. And I was like, good to know. We will find another way to address that. So it's not always like win-win, like everybody loves it, but you got to try it. And I want patients to try it. I'm like, give it your best shot. If you absolutely hate it, we don't have to do it.
Well, and I have to assume that even if they do hate it, but they start to see some results and those results are what they're there for, then they can trudge through maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I have to assume.
Yeah. And I like it because they can use things that are still working well for them, to help them work on the things that need brushing up on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm ready for ARCs now. Are you ready for ARCs?
I'm ready for ARCs. Okay, remind us, what does it stand for? I know you read the acronyms before, but I've already forgotten.
No worries. That's what I'm here for, homie. Okay, so ARCs is attentive reading, constraint, summarization. It is a cognitive linguistic treatment that focuses on reading and verbally summarizing text to improve discourse.
Interesting.
So this one is built to improve verbalizing at the discourse level, conversation level, telling a story type of thing. So this is specifically for people with mild aphasia, where the original CART was built for people with severe aphasia and agraphia, and then I just heavily modified it.
Interesting.
ARCs was specifically built for mild aphasia.
Okay.
And it uses cognitive linguistic skills to improve your discourse level by reading and verbally summarizing, right? Like, I love this so much. It's such a good time because on the surface, it is very simple and straightforward to execute. So I feel like SLPs everywhere will be like, sweet. It is deceptively, can be like deceptively challenging, like where you will get a lot of bang for your buck from this one. So I feel like because it seems to be simple to implement, people might be like, oh, well, that might not be complex enough or hard enough for my patients, but once I get into it, I think you might kind of see where it works.
Okay.
So ARCs has been shown to improve the informativeness, efficiency, and topic maintenance in conversation. And you're using the cognitive skills of attention and intentional language to address those things. So another thing I love about ARCs is like I said, it's a relatively easy treatment and it requires minimal preparation. What you need are some written articles that are of interest to the client or your patient, and then the very simple written instructions for summarizing the article's content. In the research, in the literature, it recommends starting with short paragraphs written at a 6th grade level and then adjusting up or down from there based on the client's abilities. And in the resources that I've provided to you, I linked to a couple different tools where you can easily check the grade level of the material that you're using.
That's awesome.
And sources to get material, because of course you can use whatever the patient has, like whatever the patient's interested in reading, like they can bring in their own stuff, but there's also a lot of options that I talked about that and I will talk about in the future about where to get reading material for this that is simple and easy, so you're not like, oh, this is something that's going to take me a long time to prep for. Not necessarily. There are loads of other resources that I'll talk about that cuts down that prep time.
That's awesome. You are a wealth of resources. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not just going to like tell you about something and be like, okay, now go figure out how to do it. That's not helpful.
No, I know. I love it. That's why we're here. It's why you're here. It's fantastic. Keep going.
All right. So as I mentioned, your patients need to have connected speech beyond the sentence level and the ability to read basic paragraphs. In other words, our patients with mild aphasia. This is great to use with your patients who have difficulty with maintaining topic of conversation, who have uninformative or empty speech, who have difficulty with auditory comprehension and retention, who have difficulty with writing, because there is actually a modified version of this in the literature that is ARCs for writing. And I'll talk about that a little bit too. It's great to use with patients who have difficulty with reading comprehension and retention because, hello, you're reading. So even though this was made for improving discourse, it will also aid in reading comprehension and retention because you're attentively focused on what you're reading and summarizing it as you go. And it's great for people with difficulty with word finding and difficulty with attention. So as we work with patients with mild aphasia, we start to bring in a lot more of those cognitive elements to our therapy that deal with attention, working memory, executive functioning type of things.
And these are all integrative skills, right? I mean, I know I'm in pediatrics, but just thinking about how you may have a strength or weakness in just one of these areas and may have participated in activities that focus on just one of those areas, but using them all together in a natural way is a whole different ball game.
Mm-hmm.
Is that still true in adults?
Yes.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah, for sure.
So keep going.
Okay. So that kind of gives you an idea of who you can use ARCs with and how it might benefit them and what types of things you can address with it. All right. So now I want to talk about the protocol. How do you do ARCs in therapy? So you need a piece of reading material, and that should be at approximately a 6th grade reading level, a couple paragraphs long. And what you do is you highlight the certain sections, like you break it up into chunks. So you want them to read 2 to 3 sentences out loud. And what you'll tell them is read out only the outlined portion and be prepared to summarize that information. So you've indicated where they start and stop. And while they're reading out loud, correct any reading errors if they occur. That's step 1. Step 2, they're going to reread it silently for comprehension as many times as they need to. So you'll tell them, read the sentences again silently to yourself until you're sure you understand the material. Once they do that, they summarize it with the constraints. And you'll have these printed off on a piece of paper or a little card or something, or you can just handwrite them. And those 3 constraints are, number 1, no opinions, summarize only what is written. So don't add anything to it. And it's funny, I'm going to diverge a little bit here because that first one always bothered me. I was like, but I like their opinions. They want to share their opinions. That's what keeps them interested and engaged, right? I actually got to interview Dr. Rogowski, who created this and published this. And so
Cool.
I got to ask her, like, why? And she had, of course, the best information and the reasons why. And so that's episode like 107 on the podcast on Speech Uncensored.
We'll link that in the show notes too. And I have I'm wondering, I have an idea of why in my brain, and I'm dying to know if I'm right.
It is. Okay. Tell me what you think.
No, then I'm on the spot.
Oh, well, but I want to
okay,
know.
This is my guess. My guess is that generating an opinion is a different linguistic skill that recruits different neurological pathways because it's your own thoughts and language, which is very different than processing and regurgitating the thoughts and ideas of someone else.
Okay, that is really awesome. I actually have no idea if that's a thing or not.
If anybody's listening and knows if that's a thing, or please write in and tell me so that I can have this settled.
That's awesome. So the constraint there is that they don't get distracted and they stay on topic, because if you remember, one of the things that this can help with is the patients who have difficulty maintaining the topic of conversation, or they have uninformative or empty speech. So it's getting them to focus on what is there, not get distracted by inserting their own opinions or thoughts. Because that actually will kind of add like a cognitive load to it, because now they've got to remember not only what was there, but also what they think of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So
that was way smarter than my opinion, than my thought.
I liked it. I liked it a lot. At the end of it, you can totally like spend some time talking about their opinions on whatever it was they were reading. Like, I'm all for that. But the way it was created, that's constraint number 1. The other 2 constraints are, don't use the word thing or stuff. Like, they need to use the specific words, and not using the pronouns she, he, it, or they. If there is a name of a person in there, they need to use the name. So it's getting them to use specific terminology and not that like empty speech, uninformative, non-specific language. So those are like the 3 rules. Those are the 3 constraints. And you have that on a little piece of paper for them to help kind of remind them and guide them. And they do this for each small portion of the reading material. Okay, so once they've read it silently, step 2, is reading it silently to themselves. So they understand the material. You ask them to summarize that small portion of the reading passage, maintaining the topic and using only meaningful and relevant words. So no extraneous information, no general words, no pronouns. Then you do that step 1 and step 2, reading out loud attentively, correcting any errors, having them reread it silently and summarizing it with the constraints for each small portion of the reading passage. Then they're going to summarize the whole article.
Okay.
That's ARCs.
Okay. So that works on a lot of different, it's another really flexible intervention.
I agree with you. It is flexible.
It sounds like it's, both of the treatment approaches that you've reviewed seem very modifiable to a variety of different clients, patients, profiles.
Yep. And that's what I love. I love being flexible. I love adjusting things because every person you work with has a very different Goldilocks zone. And that Goldilocks zone is impacted by a lot of different factors. It's not just the severity of their impairments that affects the Goldilocks zone. It's their confidence. It's their willingness to try. It's their motivation level, all kinds of things. So.
And do you have, I know you had mentioned that you have some resources for different written paragraphs where people can, resources where people can go and find these different kinds of paragraphs. Are there other specific, like a more specific or structured ways that you can modify ARCs?
Okay. Yes. There are two things that are out there in the literature. One is ARCs W. So that's the attentive reading with constraint summarization written. So you address paragraph level writing as well as discourse because you can still have them describe things, verbalize it, but they're writing it. And that form makes it perfect for homework, right? Because that's what they're going to do. I love it when people can practice their homework with their significant other or with other family members at home. But what I find most often is that their loved one, they don't always have the best relationship when it comes to like homework, right? Like I know it's got to be exactly the same in the pediatric world where parents can't really help their kids with it because there's that like, I don't know what it is. I'm sure there's like a name, people have studied it, they know all about it, but it's like, they just won't do for their parents what they'll do for you in therapy, right?
Sure. I mean, we've used this example a lot on the podcast. I always say that it's hard for me to do homework with my kids because my dinner is burning. The home environment is just a very different environment than a clinic where there are variables that you can control. The home is full of, distractions, comfort, other things to do, other leisure skills to engage in, complex relationships. So, the dynamic between the husband and wife or the patient and the caregiver, does that have any barriers to it that prevent them from working together or giving critical feedback or practicing on a regular basis? I mean, there's so many different variables in the home environment. No matter across all of speech pathology, like no matter who your patient is, home is different than a clinic, just period. And I think that was something that I had to learn over the course of many years of being a therapist. When I was first a young new graduate, I would just say, and I worked in an outpatient clinic also, but it was for pediatrics. And we did home programming, and I would just be like, well, why can't you just do it? It was hard for me to realize how busy the home environment actually is until I was more of a baked grown up, I guess you could say.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And so that's why when I'm working with adults, I try to give them things that they can do independently. I'm all about, because like what I want them to do with their spouse is to reap the benefits of the work that we're doing and facilitating their communication. So I tend to prefer to give more independent type work so that the patient also gets that sense of like autonomy back, right? It's like, can there be one thing they don't need help with right now, And that can be their homework. They can do their homework on their own. So doing the written version of ARCs is perfect for homework. It can be done by hand or by typing. And the important part is that writing allows for more explicit self-monitoring, which I love because I'm all about getting them through that like problem solving 3-step program, identifying those errors, generating solutions, and executing them independently. And it can be carried over into written discourse needs, such as email, text messages, and social media stuff. So I love the written version. There's also a variation for memory, and it's called RASR. So read attentively, summarize, review. And it's a memory training technique based on ARCs that aims to aid the retrieval of information read in a passage. So it requires the client to read an unfamiliar passage with the intent of recalling the information later. And this is information that I found on Tactus Therapy website. They do a whole bunch of how-tos where they scan the literature and they find these evidence-based techniques and they write it up in a way that you can understand, digest, and use in your practice. So that's also one of the resources that I've provided is a link to the how-tos so that people can go find it and read it as well.
That's incredibly helpful.
Mm-hmm. It really is. It's such a gift. I really appreciate that resource. Okay, so what I want to do now is go through a couple of options online for sourcing that reading material. So I'm very into health literacy. So giving people the information about like what's going on with their health. So at choosemyplate.gov, there's a lot of information there about like managing diabetes and diabetes education, which is often a comorbidity with a lot of people that we see. So, it doesn't have to be on aphasia. Totally can be. Like you can go to stroke.org and get lots of information on that you can have your patients read as part of like this exercise with ARCs. So not only are they learning about the stroke and what it does and the different types of strokes, you're doing like therapy. It's great. So I love blending in like health literacy education with like therapeutic interventions.
That's awesome.
Another good one is the Brain Injury Association of America. So BIAUSA.org has tons of information. And also Parkinson's. So APDA, Parkinson.org. They actually have PDFs. So you can just like go and print off some PDFs and go to town. Tons of like densely packed information, which is good for those really high level people. And even if your patient doesn't like necessarily have Parkinson's, this could be useful if they have family members or friends. Like I've used information on strokes with a patient who did not have a stroke, but I used ARCs with them more for the cognitive elements of it that they were struggling with. And they were like, they loved it. They loved learning about strokes because they had family members who had them. They had friends who had experienced a stroke. And they're like, this is so insightful. Like this really helps me understand what's going on with them and what they're going through. Okay. So I just had to like plug those things. You can provide reading material that is other stuff too.
Well, you have so many additional resources listed on this handout. I'm looking at one and I'm dying to ask you what it is because the name is pretty unique.
Okay. Tell me.
The Gunning Fog Index. What on earth is that?
Okay. So those are tools to measure the readability level. Like the authors recommend starting at that 6th grade reading level. If you're not sure what reading level something is that you're sourcing, you can go to these websites that I've linked and they will tell you like what grade level it is. So there's the simple measure of gobbledygook. Like that is legit a serious measure that's like in the literature, in the resource. It's called SMOG for short, the simple measure of gobbledygook.
I can't believe these names. Like this handout is so full of resources and then you read the word gobbledygook.
Yeah.
I can't believe that's in the literature.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. So the Gunning Fog Index is another one. And Microsoft Word also has a readability tool. So you can copy and paste stuff in there and find out what reading level it's at.
Oh, that's interesting.
There's also the readable/free readability test tool link on there is something that you can copy and paste a URL of a website or a page, and it will tell you what the like average readability of that page is. So you can just pull up a website and have them read off your computer or something. If you want to print something off on paper from a website, I also linked a print friendly and PDF tool on there. So again, it pulls the information and makes it into a PDF. So it's just that, none of the ads or the other crazy stuff around it.
Love it. Love it. You've got so much stuff on here.
Yeah, girl. So much stuff. I love it.
Did you say this one already? This is an interesting sounding one, but it's spelled funny. The flesh reading ease formula.
Mm-hmm. That's
but
another
flesh. I mean, when you read it out loud, I was going to read it and I was like, that sounds very dark. The flesh reading ease formula, but it's FLESCH.
Right. Yep. That's another one that will tell you like the reading level of it. Like there's more than one. Like I put those top 3 and there's more than those out there. Those are just kind of the ones that I found online that were accessible, free, and generally gave you like the grade level reading. So you can find one that works for you best, what your preference is.
Interesting. So you have given us a wealth of information. You're obviously a mastermind of creating, taking protocols and pieces of evidence-based practice from the literature and modifying them for your patients. I love so many things that you said, particularly related to making sure that we center client and family values, client and patient perspectives and values, and making sure we're addressing the things that are really impacting them and affecting them, engaging in therapy at a level that is, pushing them to their edge, but not over the edge. And, everything, the home programming, all of it. I guess I'm wondering if, in our last couple of minutes, what are your words of wisdom? What are your parting thoughts to the SLPs listening who might be interested in switching over to this field or aren't really used to working with a more mild impairment on the aphasia spectrum? What are your parting thoughts?
I think my parting thoughts would be, it's more accessible than you might imagine. And there are some really great tools out there to help you either make that transition if you're moving from a pediatric focused caseload to an adult focused, or if you're balancing between the two, if you work both. And so you're kind of pulled in 2 different directions. There are tons of great resources out there to help you be the best clinician that you can be and provide the best services you can. There are SLPs out there who are really interested in bridging that divide between interpreting the literature to be clinically useful and relevant and making it facilitating that for you. I know that's one of my passions. And now that I have the development council that you mentioned earlier, that helps me to amplify those resources that we want to put out there. Because we're all driven to give the very best therapy we can to our patients. But there are limitations on us. There's only so many hours in a day. There's only so many minutes in our workday where we can carve out to try to do some of this research, to do this prep. So if 100%, I can
say it again, it's so true. It's so true. And it's such a problem.
It is. It's such a problem that that's what I want to dedicate my work to, is facilitating it so that you have a resource to go to that kind of breaks it down, shows you that it is accessible. Doing this type of work where we can incorporate more of what's meaningful to the patient and more holistic, kind of incorporating all the realms of language, I feel like we'll have the best outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. This was really, really, really informative and helpful. I learned a ton knowing very little about this. I'm sure our listeners did too. Just for the sake of saying it, I know I said it at the beginning, but if you are interested in using this episode for ASHA CEUs, you can cruise on over to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. You can find the episode and click through the links to take the quiz. Leanne was incredibly gracious and generous and has created this wonderful handout And that will be available for download on our website as well. All of the references that we mentioned through the course of the episode will be listed in the show notes, as will links to the podcasts that we mentioned and Leanne's podcast, Speech Uncensored podcast. Thank you again, Leanne, so much for joining us. This was really wonderful. And we hope to see you here again soon.
That'd be lovely. It's been a pleasure. I'm so honored to be on your podcast. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed prepping this and preparing it. It's so great to get nerdy about stuff and share things.
It is. Well, thank you so much. You're the best.
You're the best.